Today's topic is Trump and the Special Prosecutor, Part 2. And I am Robert Whaley, retired professor at Ohio University, and we will talk about the FBI director, or former FBI director, James Comey, and the Congressional Intelligence Committee with Dave DeWitt, who is a journalist and editor of the Athens News, and we will have an interesting, lively dialogue about this debatable subject. Now, today is May 23rd, and this is Athens Speakout number 405. The debate proves that the theme of my many shows, debate is the oxygen of democracy, is still the topic, is now worth coming to the forefront. Last week, we started off with part 1 with the pressure, mostly from the Democrats, demanding that the special prosecutor be set up that would get to the bottom of why and when Donald Trump fired FBI Director James Comey. The pressure was probably mostly from the Democrats, who were demanding that the special prosecutor be set up to investigate Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin's Russia. The Democrats hoped that this might lead to the impeachment of Donald Trump following the pattern of Richard Nixon's impeachment from 1972-73, with many long investigations. According to me, Robert Whaley, this issue now is for the great majority of Congress and the Attorney General's office to decide to investigate FBI Director James Comey. What is the FBI's knowledge of Trump's political policy toward Russia? Should Congress appoint a special prosecutor? It is up to the majority of a bipartisan joint resolution of Congress and its congressional intelligence committees to form a second path of investigation for the confused Trump administration. As of May 17th to this day, the 23rd of May, Trump has the fear that James Comey testifying before Congress would lead to embarrassing information about his financial dealings with Russia. Trump himself decided to speed up the process. Trump had the power to have his acting Attorney General appoint Bob Mueller as the new FBI director, replacing James Comey, and the special prosecutor then would not be necessary. Trump apparently now fears that James Comey, with good notes, might reveal his financial records and Trump's relationship to Russia. From Trump's point of view, the problem with the joint congressional investigation committees would be that James Comey might reveal as witnesses too many facts about the financial dealings between Trump and Putin. The question now remains who and with which FBI director, Bob Mueller, or which prosecutor, Director Bob Mueller, will he pledge the loyalty to Trump first, or will Bob Mueller follow the previous honest attorney generals? Mueller may follow Comey and tell the truth the way he sees it and not pledge any personal loyalty to Trump.
Real quick here, Professor, I just want to clear something up.
Yeah.
Trump has not appointed a new FBI director yet. He's appointed former FBI director Robert Mueller as, well, he didn't appoint him. His acting deputy attorney general.
That's the legalistic stuff.
Right.
And
appointed Mueller
you got that straight.
as the investigator for the Russian,
right,
for the Justice Department's Russian investigation.
You just clarified my
ad lib. Yeah, and I just wanted to make sure the audience was clear on that. That's all.
Good.
So sorry to interrupt.
You're legally on first base.
Yeah. So,
I am legal.
and I think that it's a good thing that Robert Mueller has been appointed.
Okay.
as some people might recall, Mueller and Jim Comey were the guys during the George W. Bush years who were in the George W. Bush Justice Department, and the administration asked them to do basically illegal wiretapping of American civilians.
Right.
And they stepped up and threatened to resign
Right.
unless the Bush administration could get their directives to conform to the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment of the Bill of Rights.
Well, good.
Illegal
I'm glad
search
you
and seizure.
clarified that.
So I think that shows they've been willing to take on presidents before. They were willing. Jim Comey and Robert Mueller were willing
But
to
he was wishy-washy
face
because
down
first
George
he
W.
leaned
Bush.
toward at Trump, and then he leaned toward Hillary Clinton, and then went back.
Comey.
Yeah, in November, in October, before the election,
Right.
the public, as part of the public, I didn't know who James Comey was tilting the facts for or against.
Yeah.
And that became part of the confusion, and neither did the voters.
Well, I think that was one of Comey's big mistakes, especially that October when he announced the reopening of the investigation because of the emails that were found on Huma Abedin's computer. And I think that was a big mistake on his point. As he explained it during his previous testimony to Congress, he thought that it was a matter of either being transparent or being secretive, and he chose to be transparent. I don't think that he was, from his testimony, it didn't sound like he was attempting to be political when he did that, although it did have an enormous political impact, and I think that was a really regrettable mistake on his part. As far as his goal, I think that Comey's been fairly clear that he wants the FBI, and as director of the FBI, he strive to make the FBI an independent law enforcement agency
Right.
above politics.
Okay.
And I think that's the
Well, I don't have
FBI's
any
appropriate
disagreement
role.
with that. I think that's fine. I'm just saying that legally it's still in the state of speculation.
Yeah, at this point, I mean, we've got new stuff coming out every day.
Right.
John Brennan testified before the Congress.
Now, who's John Brennan again?
He was the CIA director under Barack Obama, and he resigned his post on January 20th when Trump became president.
Okay.
If you'll recall, he was the guy who took on Trump when Trump compared the U.S. intelligence community to Nazis.
Okay.
And John Brennan stood up to him and talked about how that was entirely inappropriate, and he criticized Trump for making a political speech in front of the CIA's memorial wall honoring fallen CIA officers. And in testimony before Congress, John Brennan has said today that he testified that he has been very concerned about ties between the Trump administration campaign and the Russians, and he even testified that he called the head of the Russian intelligence agency to warn them that if they were interfering in the United States elections, it would be a really bad thing for the long-term goal of peace and stability between the two countries. He said that it would set back the relations between the United States and Russia for decades. He said that the American people wouldn't stand for it. And nevertheless, he testified the Russians went ahead and continued to meddle in the U.S. election in favor of Donald Trump, he testified, over Hillary Clinton. And I think that he's been, what he told the Russian director of intelligence has proven accurate. I think that the Russian meddling has and will set the relations between the United States and Russia back decades.
Okay. Well, okay. So to get back here to the last 2 weeks, we spent a great deal of time speculating about Trump's inconsistencies during these first 100 days. The Democrats want to compare Nixon's problems with Donald Trump's problems. In the Nixon case, the investigations led to 2 to 3 years investigation to get at the bottom of the Watergate break-in and the crimes stemming from the White House. An obscure CIA agent, James McCord, worked in Nixon's White House. The investigation took 2 or 3 years to prove that Nixon's White House knew about this and many other possible plots and unprovable crimes. Besides the Watergate break-in, there were another 40 to 62 plots were added to Nixon's possible crimes stemming from the White House. The Attorney General, now this is the important legal point, holds an ambiguous relationship to the President. In George Washington's day, the Attorney General was the personal attorney of the President. As American bureaucracy grew, and the bureaucracy of the Department of Justice grew in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Attorney General, by 1973, when the Nixon problem began, wore 2 hats. The first hat was the partisan defender of the sitting president and his party. And the second hat is a bipartisan staff of judges, civil servants, police departments, and honest civil servants who are supposed to protect the entire body politic from ambitious governors, members of Congress, and even presidents who are pursuing their own power grabs. Who ordered McCord to break into the Watergate Hotel? So Nixon's investigations continued for many months, from January to October of 1973. On October of 1973, Nixon appointed 3 special investigators and fired them all in one day. First was Elliot Richardson, second was Archibald Cox, and third was William Ruckelshaus. This was called by the press the Saturday Night Massacre. So Nixon ordered his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, and his assistant, John Ehrlichman, to fire the prospective would-be special prosecutors. Nixon was impeached by the House Judiciary Committee, which had bipartisan Democrats and Republican members. The House impeaches the president, but it is up to the Senate to convict the president of high crimes, now called felonies, and misdemeanors. So, to Dave DeWitt, do you have any further comment about the Nixon administration's fate?
Well, I just want to point out that the Nixon administration, the thing that was never really revealed was who ordered the break-in. They never tied Nixon ordering the break-in.
Now, who is they and who never?
How
long did it take?
The investigators never figured out who exactly. They never confirmed that Richard Nixon ordered the break-in. And in fact, there's still some question and conflicting testimony.
John Dean. Do you know anything about John Dean?
Yeah, of course. He's all part of it. There is also some conflicting testimony from the people who broke in about what they were searching for when they broke in. But what really got Nixon in the end was the cover-up.
That's
true.
It
was the tapes. It was the fact that he had ordered the cover-up, that he was actively participating in trying to do the cover-up, that's what he ended up being impeached for. And I think that that's important and relevant to what's happening right now.
Good.
Because Donald Trump asked James Comey to see his way clear to letting the Michael Flynn investigation go. Right. And now it's come out just today that he not only did he ask the FBI director that, he also asked the heads of 2 other intelligence agencies to let this investigation go.
That's very good.
So these are all, I mean, again, we're seeing a president attempting to do some sort of cover-up. He wants to, and he's fired the guy who refused him, James Comey, and we see over and over again confirmation that the president has attempted to obstruct this investigation, which is obstruction of justice, which is what Nixon was impeached for. It's what Bill Clinton was impeached for, and I wouldn't
be
by the House.
Well, yeah, it didn't get very far.
No, but it was obstruction of justice, and that's
How
what
long did that case
that's
last?
what I think. Well, we might have years for this with Donald Trump as well. It might be another year or two before
Yeah, but
actual articles of impeachment are
Bill
enacted
Clinton
upon.
retired in an ambiguous. There are some people who like Bill Clinton and some who don't, but there's been
Sure.
no legal case against him.
Right.
It was-
But it was obstruction of justice. My only point, and I'm
You
not
say
commenting
wasn't,
on it.
The
charge
has
against-
to be the charge was, but he's never
Right.
been convicted.
And that's my point. The
He's-
charge against him was obstruction of justice. The House
the charge.
impeached him for
Okay.
that.
Okay, fine.
And that had to do with his own perjury. It wasn't anything to do with Monica Lewinsky in the Oval Office. It was him perjuring himself. So my point is that there's a pattern of obstruction of justice, and I think that it's fairly clear that President Donald Trump has already committed obstruction of justice.
Okay, fine. I don't have any objections to that decision. So anyway, you more or less have finished your comments on the Nixon administration and his reputation, or do you want to say anything more about James Dean?
Well, James Dean, for a while there, was really out on a limb because until those tapes came out, it was only his testimony
That's right.
that said that Nixon was doing this cover-up.
Right.
So he was really out on his own there until it was discovered that these tapes existed. And that's another question that we have right now. The Trump administration has kind of indicated that there might be tapes. And so the Congress, has, I think it's Justin Amash, has now asked the White House if there are any recordings of conversations that take place in the Oval Office.
Right.
He's asked for transcripts of all those conversations to be turned over to the Congress. And frankly, I hope that there are recordings. I hope that there are transcripts, and I think that
Okay. Well,
that
we'll have
might
to
be the
wait
smoking
until
gun.
June to find out.
It's going to be a while.
Well, I guess we've more or less finished with Nixon. And then we'll return now to the problems of the majority leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, and the House Speaker Paul Ryan, Republican from Wisconsin. And they are stalling about any possibility of appointing a bipartisan joint congressional investigation committee. So that's going to be part of the next month or so's story. So Trump's decision to appoint Mueller as the FBI director could lead to more revelations coming out of both houses of Congress. Speculation is now implying that the Republicans are getting worried about losing votes in the 2018 election. Now, I want to get back to Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. He said in a speech to the State Department diplomats that the Trump administration's America First approach to the world means decoupling the United States foreign policy from any values such as human rights and freedom. Well, if Tillerson is saying that, it's one of more example of the Trump administration's total incompetence. It is amazing to me that at this late date, there are still loyal Republican voters who still believe that Nixon did not commit any crimes. Tillerson is saying, in effect, that the United States is now no longer a democracy. Who defines democracy? It is an open confession that Trump's administration might not step down in 2020. If Dave DeWitt and I have the slightest disagreement on how fast the impeachment process will take, Dave is looking for a future, and his assumes that Trump will be gone before the 2018 elections. Is that true or false?
Oh, I'm not sure about that. I don't.
That's too much.
I think that this will. It seems to be that these dominoes are falling more quickly than usual, but I certainly wouldn't assume that he'd be gone.
Okay.
Yeah, no predictions on my end.
So I am, as a historian, a little bit more cautious. It is really unpredictable what Bob Mueller will reveal about Trump's financial records, and that will convince the Republicans as to, and other members of Congress, to join the Democrats for a thorough congressional investigation. I think it would be unfortunate if the Democrats win votes from the Republicans in Congress based on prejudice against Russia. It has long been a long line of Rachel Maddow of MSNBC. She claims that Trump revealed to the Russian foreign minister and the Russian ambassador to the United States some secret intelligence information from the state of Israel. Trump has, like his predecessor, Barack Obama had secret relationships to Benjamin Netanyahu's government in Tel Aviv. So, is Rachel Maddow's opinion that the American relationship to Israel is the most important of America's so-called allies? Rachel Maddow is not a historian. She cannot tell the difference between a bilateral alliance ratified by the Senate as a treaty. America's major allies are members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In 1949, the original 12 members have been expanded to 16 with the addition of Greece, Turkey, Germany in 1951, 55, and finally Spain in 1986. The American relationship to Israel is based on each president's personal, bilateral, ad hoc executive agreements with Israel concluded in secrecy. The CIA has connections to Israel's Mossad. Looking at all of the presidents from Harry Truman to Barack Obama, there have been possibly 3 critics of Israel's foreign policy. Number 1 was Jimmy Carter, 1976 to 1980. Number 2 was George Herbert Walker Bush, 1991, during the first Iraq War. The third German-born Jew, Henry Kissinger, treated Israel in a balance of power relationship, which pitted Egypt's Anwar Sadat against the Israeli government. Kissinger was putting pressure on Israel to negotiate with the Palestinians to make concessions to the occupied Palestinians. This pitted Israel's claims as a democracy against the Egyptian dictator Anwar Sadat as 2 sovereign states. In negotiating a truce in the Yom Kippur War, 1972, the 4th Arab-Israeli War, Kissinger put pressure on Israel to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula and recognize the independent state of Egypt. This diplomatic move broke the Arab United Front, including Syria and Lebanon and Iraq. This diplomacy separated Egypt from the rest of the Arab bloc. Barack Obama's relationship is the 4th possibility with Israel, has been somewhat strained, and is now known that in the last election, Benjamin Netanyahu preferred Trump over Hillary Clinton, and especially over Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont. Suppose Congress does force Trump to sell his Russian properties in the United States and release his tax returns. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is still in charge of the big oil companies. If Trump loses all credibility, Tillerson has the choice of escalating war against Russia or try and figure out a new balance of power in the unstable Middle East region.
Can I jump in
Yeah,
here
go
for
ahead.
a second? I'd like to kind of tie some threads together, because right now President Trump is on a tour of the Middle East.
Yeah.
He was in Saudi Arabia the past couple of days, and he was in Israel today, I believe. And he goes on to the Vatican and before a big NATO conference at the end of the week. And in Saudi Arabia, he struck a $100 billion arms deal with the Saudis to supply them with weapons. And I found that an interesting commitment, actually in line with what you mentioned earlier about Tillerson's commitment about decoupling U.S. foreign policy from values such as human rights and freedom, because the Trump administration just signed a $100 billion arms agreement with a country that denies women the vote.
That's right.
Denies women the ability to drive.
That's right. Beats
women in public for what they wear.
That's right.
Is one of the biggest human rights violators in the Middle East.
That's correct.
Is their rich people are some of the biggest funders and sponsors of terrorism across the Middle East. It's a country committed to Sunniism, which is the Sunni versus Shiite Muslim, basically war since the 7th century about the succession to Muhammad.
Yeah, right.
And the Trump administration has now come firmly down on the side of the Saudis, one of the most repugnant I think, regimes in the Middle East.
Yeah, you're looking at it from the point of view of an American Democrat.
And so talking about decoupling U.S. foreign policy from values such as freedom and human rights, I think that the Trump administration just did that about as well as they possibly could have. And the other thing I wanted to mention was Barack Obama's relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. Bibi Netanyahu is, as he's known a little bit more informally, is a hardliner. He's an extremist. He's a right-wing hardliner and an extremist, and he showed enormous amounts of disrespect to President Obama when he was in office by coming to the United States to address a joint session of Congress without consultation. At the invitation of Republicans, without consultation from the Obama administration State Department. Netanyahu has undermined almost all of Obama's initiatives and overtures for peace in the Middle East. And now Trump is in Israel and he's talking about peace, but he has not put forth any plan that I've seen.
He hasn't got a plan.
So,
he doesn't know what to do.
And that's probably why he hasn't put anything forth. So they're going to talk a lot about this in the next couple of days, but
probably the next couple of months and maybe years.
But until we actually see anything, that's all it is talk and hot air. So I just wanted to make those points.
Well, I'm glad you kind of agree with what I'm saying about John Kerry. Secretary of State John Kerry, in the last years of the Obama administration, was changing his line on a ceasefire in the Syrian war and on the escalation of the war against ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Tillerson might argue that the America's relationship with Israel is a bigger problem than the so-called Russian threat. The United States, because of the nuclear arms race, has a vital interest in continuing to work for world disarmament problems. There is a basis for an American-Russian agreement on how to handle the Islamic terrorists in the greater Middle East. Russia and its friendly Central Asian states, ethnically divided, have at least 20 million hostile Muslims. Vladimir Putin would like to force the United States, Americans, to make an agreement to repress Arabs and Muslim jihadists on a regional basis. Donald Trump must know that in talking about America first would cause hostility in the Democratic Party, particularly among Jewish Americans. For the most Republican Party leaders, isolationism is a viable foreign policy which died after Pearl Harbor by the declaration of Michigan Republican Arthur Vandenberg. The long Cold War, beginning in 1945, ended officially in 1991, was 180 degrees hostile to the policy against isolationism. So isolationism is trying to come back through Trump's fiddling around. As a peace-minded American citizen, I became critical of America's imperial foreign policy, which began beneath the mass media's propaganda in 1960 with John Kennedy's invasion of Cuba. If Donald Trump has learned any history, he would have known that the United States is still #1 in the air and at sea. The United States is still committed to NATO, signed in 1949, and expanded to 16 members. So my question again to Dave DeWitt, do you see any coherent Trump foreign policy line emerging in regard to the approach of the United States to Syria, China, and Russia?
I see nothing coherent about any policy initiative of the Trump administration, foreign or domestic.
Right.
I think that the administration so far has been defined by its incompetence, by its incoherence on almost every issue.
Right. I agree with that.
Heck, they released a budget today with a $2 trillion basic math error. They overshot their own budget by $2 trillion by not adding numbers correctly. That's how incompetent they are. And it is funny, but it's also scary.
Yeah, it is funny. But you got to have a sardonic sense of humor.
Yeah, or a very dark one.
So, to get back to this problem.
So what's your thoughts on that?
Okay. What I'm trying to say is that the United States cannot police the world. The Monroe Doctrine, proclaimed in 1823, was proclaimed as a sphere of influence over Latin America. The British welcomed the Monroe Doctrine. Most Latin Americans know that the United States is an imperial country. In 1947, the State Department and the Truman administration and the mass media proclaimed the Truman Doctrine. Roosevelt and Kennedy did not issue any doctrine. The word doctrine confuses religion with a secular foreign policy. Some misinformed journalists may proclaim some nonsense about a Nixon doctrine, yet I do not think Nixon or Kissinger ever used the word doctrine. When the United States began to intervene in the Syrian civil war under George W. Bush 43, the justification was that Syria's dictator Bashar al-Assad was threatening the state of Israel. In my mind, America's military intervention in Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan were already overreach in any informal imperial land grants. America intervened in the Korean War, 1950 to 53, in order to protect South Korea, which is really a satellite or protected state, from North Korea's aggression. North Korea was a de facto satellite state, originally of the Soviet Union. And North Korea became a Chinese satellite or protected of the People's Republic of China gradually from April 1951 to the ceasefire accord of July 1953. Jimmy Carter tried to negotiate a multilateral peace treaty between North Korea, South Korea, guaranteed by the big powers, United States, Japan, the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China. The Republicans in Congress blocked the State Department and Jimmy Carter's peaceful plans. It is ironic and another poor joke on the part of Donald Trump to even being suggesting another round of the Korean War. The real estate dealer has no business in talking about war and peace. if there is another Korean War, it should be up to Congress to declare such a war as the Constitution specifies. Another question.
I'm going to agree with you there, but I want to stop just for a station break.
Good, thank you.
So, as we're going to move on to another topic.
Okay, so I am Robert Whaley, retired historian, and my colleague and friend is Dave DeWitt, active journalist for the Athens News, and we are in slight disagreement about the importance of history and the past as it impacts the possible future, which is the open book. Okay, is that good enough?
All right.
So, do you want to say anything more about the Korean War?
I think that, well, I think that the Trump administration's first little effort in the Korean situation, where they said that the USS Carl Vinson was heading to the South China Sea over toward North Korea, and then in fact it wasn't. It was actually heading to Australia, and I just want to say
another
that,
bluff.
Don't you hate it when you lose your aircraft carrier? You know, the Pacific Ocean's pretty big. You know, who hasn't misplaced an aircraft carrier before?
I don't know whether he scared the Chinese or not.
Well, I think that he's found, I think from what he's admitted and said personally, he's found that his false accusations of China manipulating currency and those such things aren't really helping him with getting the Chinese to help him with the North Koreans. I think that he's found villainizing China isn't a great foreign policy strategy when it comes to figuring out the situation with North Korea, and I'm glad that he's backed off on that because it was stupid to begin with. So.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce a new topic, and we are going to show a chart published on the 25th of April, 2017. In the USA Today, entitled From Ronald to Donald, the First 100 Days. I think the USA Today was trying to write a so-called nonpartisan piece in which the editors tried to avoid making any partisan shots at Donald Trump. They have a chart which compares Trump's 100 days, which was selected previously, with other presidents. The results of their poll are fixed because they chose to begin with Ronald Reagan in 1980. The importance of the first 100 days began with Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. He indeed passed dozens of significant bills which became law. Roosevelt had the advantage of fact that both houses of Congress were in the hands of a large Democratic majority. The Democratic Congress was elected in 1930 because of the Great Depression of October 1929. So the test of the 100 days, the first 100 days, for later presidents is somewhat unfair. USA Today published the poll by rating 6 presidents, beginning with Ronald Reagan. And 4 of these are Republicans and 2 are Democrats. The poll lists Ronald Reagan first with 68% approval in the chart. But the chart does not follow a chronological order. It follows the results of the poll of the 25th of April in 2017. Furthermore, it is unclear whether this poll was taken on the 25th of April 2017, or there were 6 polls on 6 different days of the first 100 days of 1, Ronald Reagan with 68%, followed by 2, Barack Obama with 65%, 3, George W. Bush with 62%, H.W. Bush 41, 56%, Bill Clinton, 55%, and last was Donald Trump, 43%. In short, the participants of this poll are still unclear in my mind. Every journalist and every pundit and the two-party polling systems have come up with very different numbers when doing mass polling. I have never had much confidence in any poll since Harry S. Truman defeated Governor Thomas E. Dewey in New York in 1948. The most accurate poll from 1936 was taken by George Gallup up to his death in July of 1984, just before Ronald Reagan was elected for his second term. Gallup had one simple question: which of the two candidates, asked every week between Labor Day and the last week of the November election, who do you intend to vote for in the presidential election? There were only two answers: Truman or Dewey in 48, or General Dwight Eisenhower or Governor Adlai Stevenson, governor of Illinois, in 52. As the elections continued during the controversial American-Vietnam War, 52 to 1975, new independent pollsters took more and more polls and asked more and more complex questions. Should the Vietnam War be escalated or de-escalated or turned over to the United Nations? Every congressman set up his own polling organization to get fixed ratings to favor his own personal race in 435 different House districts, plus 100 different senatorial races. So whose polls do you believe? The polling organizations became big business, competing with advertising industry and the public relations firms. Democracy was being undermined gradually from the 1950s to the Donald Trump's campaign. Vermont Bernie Sanders claimed to be that America is run by a financial oligarchy. Dollars can buy votes, dollars can buy polls. So reading the details of this chart from Ronald to Donald, the first 100 days, give the voters a warped picture of the real Ronald Reagan. The 68% is meaningless to me. As a historian, senators and presidential candidates vie for individual senatorial and presidential records and the past performances of Congress. Most campaign promises are soon forgotten. So reading the details of the essay from Ronald to Donald, USA Today, reports three major successes of Ronald Reagan. One was the major tax cuts. 2 was increased military spending. And 3, the Iranian release of U.S. hostages on Inauguration Day, January 1981. As a liberal Democrat, I think Ronald Reagan's major tax cuts were phony. Where are the statistics? Number 2, increased military spending, was a negative to this historian, who rates most American presidents as either winning a war or maintaining the peace during the time of his administration. To this historian, the 3 greatest presidents were George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Number 3, indeed, a neutral historian from the United States would give Ronald Reagan some credit, as USA did, for releasing the U.S. hostages imprisoned by the Ayatollah Khomeini's regime in Iran.
I want to give my opinion on these things as well.
Good. I'm glad you're here.
I agree that, getting U.S. hostages released from Iran can be considered a major success. I agree also with you that major tax cuts as a major success, I don't see any evidence for that whatsoever. What Reagan did with these tax cuts was he exacerbated the national debt.
Right.
He decreased revenues.
Right.
And he began the ball rolling on what's led to 40 years of the greatest wealth and income inequality that the United States has seen, even greater than the first Gilded Age. This was a major success. this began the process of creating the second Gilded Age. It
More
was
than
one
that.
of the most destructive things to happen to this country.
Beyond the Gilded Age.
and this idea of supply side economics, voodoo economics, Milton Friedman economics has been debunked by 40 years of empirical evidence.
By the Democrats.
It might have been a success to his agenda, but it was a failure for the United States of America.
Good.
And also increased military spending. Again, it might have been a success to his agenda, but all it did was grow the military industrial complex,
Correct.
which has exploded.
Correct.
And it's to me, the analogy I always like to use is it's as though a father is stacking guns and ammunition in the attic while the children go starving in the kitchen.
That's right.
That's what this agenda has done to America. And so
Right.
USA Today can call it major successes, and I guess judged from the standpoint of his policy agenda, it was a success. But for the health and well-being of the United States of America, no, not at all. It's absurd.
Good. Absolutely true. So part two was Ronald Reagan also was rated for major setbacks. USA argued that Ronald Reagan had one major setback, a weak economy from January to July 1980. This historian would agree that this fact is statistically true as reported, but Ronald Reagan was not responsible for the economic statistics produced by the American private corporations. Number two.
Oh, so this is me. I get to ask you a question.
Yeah, you
Okay.
is this really a setback?
Yes.
Or is this hot air?
Well, and that relates to the question. Do you have any comments on how polling is now a form of propaganda?
Well, we can say it again, that polls can be bought, and Truman was the last president who campaigned off the back of the railroad car with his own reputation as the vice president of Teddy Roosevelt. And Gallup had it wrong because he didn't take any polling from Friday night to Monday morning or Tuesday morning, and a lot of voters changed their mind listening to Harry Truman, particularly the farmers. And Truman said, "You haven't had it so good as under the New Deal." And they remembered the subsidies. And they said, "You know, really, do I want to vote against the Democratic Party and cut these subsidies?" So they changed their mind. And then we come out with the big headline that Truman holds up to the television, "Dewey wins," and Truman has a big grin, and he won a moral victory as a true Democrat who spoke to the American people from his own heart. But then Eisenhower began the decline, because when Eisenhower was elected in 1952, the television business became more effective, and Dewey was the advisor of Eisenhower, and they bought advertising from Madison Avenue.
Yeah.
And
I like
Breakfast of Champions. We like Wheaties. They put that on. I like Ike. You like Ike. Everybody likes Ike. The public only have 3 minutes attention span, and the 30-minute speech has gone out the window. And Adlai Stevens was an old-fashioned Democrat from Illinois and spoke for half an hour, but nobody was listening to Adlai Stevens.
Yeah, he was a bit too cerebral. He didn't speak in sound bites.
There's the ironic thing. He was a Unitarian. He was a left-winger, but the people who voted for him were the old Southern Democrats. Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama. He got 10, 11 states in 52 and 53. And I think Missouri and Tennessee changed positions or something. And this is an example of the old Southern Democratic Party establishment.
The Dixiecrats.
The Dixiecrats. And Ronald Reagan later capitalized on the move of Dixiecrats to the Republican Party.
Yeah,
and
Nixon,
the old Solid
the
South
Southern strategy.
became the Republican Solid South.
Basically, yeah, and
Yeah.
this was admitted by Lee Atwater and others. The Nixon Southern strategy, and it was carried on by Reagan and George H.W. Bush, was basically to prey on racial resentment and hoover up the South for Republicans.
So, if we go now to the second rating, 65% for Barack Obama is next, number 2 on USA's to this. USA concludes that Obama had 4 major successes. They were: economic stimulus bill was passed. 2, children's health care was expanded. 3, equal pay protections for the women were bolstered. Number 4, the federal ban on embryonic stem cell research was lifted. USA Today is obviously pro-Obama for unexplained reasons. I voted for Obama with 51% confidence, but was very critical of his cover-up of George W. Bush's interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the expansion of a paid army in Pakistan. However, in this case, I think USA's poll was quite right about Obama's 4 domestic accomplishments. Any comment or disagreement on that?
No, I agree. I think that the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was very necessary. Remember, Barack Obama came into office with unemployment over 10%
Right.
from the Great Recession that happened under George
Right.
W. Bush. He came in with financial crisis on Wall Street. He came in with a foreclosure crisis, people losing their homes across the country, losing their jobs, their lives thrown into chaos, and passing not only the stimulus bill, but the TARP recovery, everything. He basically steadied the ship, and
Right.
he steadied it very quickly, and he was criticized very heavily at the time, but I think that looking back on it now,
criticized?
well, the Republicans,
Oh,
of
the
course.
Republicans.
Yeah. But
that's clear.
I think looking back on it now, he did an admirable job in a very quick order of getting the country as stable as it could be at that time. It still took several years for the recovery to really take hold. But
That's right. The only thing I would say is the stimulus was too small.
I agree. As a piece of Keynesian economics, I would have liked to see more.
Much more, right. He saved the teachers' jobs. He saved the automobile jobs. But he didn't really extend it across the board as Keynesian economics would be.
I would have liked to see more New Deal type stuff,
That's
like
right.
The public works projects and
But you'd
things
have
such
to
as
do
that.
by cutting the so-called defense budget.
Right.
And that was a no-no. So anyway, Obama was given one major setback by USA Today. And the one setback was that the Republican Party opposed Obama's friend in the Senate, Tom Daschle, Democrat from South Dakota, who had been and had to resign from negotiating the Affordable Care Bill. Do you have any comment on that? Or do you want me to say my comment?
Well, you could say your comment because
That this was poor history. It is not a setback for Barack Obama because it was the Republican Party in the Senate who caused the setback to Tom Daschle. Perhaps USA should have cited the so-called setback of Barack Obama, not his setback, but the Republican Party's setback.
yeah. I think it was a setback for the
Poor
political career of Tom Daschle, but it didn't really touch the Obama administration very much.
Yeah.
It didn't hurt. It didn't waste any of his political capital. It didn't hurt his agenda.
Well, it slowed the healthcare bill.
It slowed the healthcare a little bit, yeah.
Right.
I suppose.
And anyway, it's question 3. Do you have any time to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the other 3 presidents, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. Briefly, the USA puts Obama number 2 with 65%. Number 3 was George W. Bush with 62%, and George H.W. Bush with 56% favorable ratings, and Bill Clinton, they're declining, with 55%. And last was Donald Trump at 43%. Perhaps we could continue this, or we could get right to the conclusion about Donald Trump's low ratings at 43%, which was the foregone conclusion established by the Bias USA poll. We only got 2 minutes to go.
So we don't have much time.
So I think this is a good ending point, and we'll have to continue next time with another show, part 3, I guess.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The only thing I'd have to say is that those approval ratings at this point, after the first 100 days for any of those presidents, none of that surprises me. You'll recall Bill Clinton had a very slow start. He had a very contentious start. So I'm not surprised that his was down at 55%. George W. Bush didn't really do much in the first, couple months of his presidency. He didn't have a lot of accomplishments, so it doesn't surprise me either. And of course, Donald Trump is, such a divisive figure. Of course, his approval rating is in the gutter after the first 100 days.
Okay, well, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Professor.
We want to keep the debate for democracy going.
And we shall next time.